seemed to be missing. I could see the black hole of her toothless mouth. She covered her face with her hand and laughed. She took off her sandals and walked into the house without giving me time to say anything. Rosa followed her. I was dumbfounded. Doña Soledad had implied that Josefina was the same age as Lydia and Rosa. I turned to Lydia. She was peering at me. I had no idea she was that old, I said. Yes, she's pretty old, she said in a matter-of-fact tone. Does she have a child? I asked. Yes, and she takes him everywhere. She never leaves him with us. She's afraid we're going to eat him. Is it a boy? A boy. How old is he? She's had him for some time, but I don't know his age. We thought that she shouldn't have a child at her age, but she didn't pay any attention to us. Whose child is he? Josefina's, of course. I mean, who's the father? The Nagual. Who else? I thought that development was quite extravagant and very unnerving. I suppose anything is possible in the Nagual's world, I said. I meant it more as a thought to myself than a statement made to Lydia. You bet, she said, and laughed. The oppressiveness of those eroded hills became unbearable. There was something truly abhorrent about that area, and Josefina had been the final blow. On top of having an ugly, old, smelly body and no teeth, she also seemed to have some sort of facial paralysis. The muscles on the left side of her face appeared to be injured, a condition which created a most unpleasant distortion of her left eye and the left side of her mouth. My oppressive mood plummeted to one of sheer anguish. For an instant, I toyed with the idea, so familiar by then, of running to my car and driving away. I complained to Lydia that I didn't feel well. She laughed and said that Josefina had no doubt scared me. She has that effect on people, she said. Everybody hates her guts. She's uglier than a cockroach. I remember seeing her once, I said, but she was young. Things change, Lydia said philosophically. One way or another. Look at Soledad. What a change, huh? And you yourself have changed. You look more massive than I remember you. You are looking more and more like the Nagual. I wanted to say that the change in Josefina was abhorrent, but I was afraid that she might overhear me. I looked at the eroded hills across the valley. I felt like fleeing from them. The Nagual gave us this house, she said, but it is not a house for rest. We had another house before that was truly beautiful. This is a place to steam up. Those mountains over there will drive you nuts. Her boldness in reading my feelings gave me a respite. I didn't know what to say. We're all naturally lazy, she went on. We don't like to strain ourselves. The Nagual knew that, so he must have figured that this place would drive us up the walls. She stood up abruptly and said that she wanted something to eat. We went to the kitchen, a semi-enclosed area with only 2 walls. At the open end, to the right of the door, there was an earthen stove. At the other end, where the 2 walls met, there was a large dining area with a long table and 3 benches. The floor was paved with smooth river rocks. The flat roof was about 10 feet high and was resting on the 2 walls and on thick supporting beams on the open sides. Lydia poured me a bowl of beans and meat from a pot which cooked on a very low fire. She heated up some tortillas over the fire. Rosa came in and sat down next to me and asked Lydia to serve her some food. I became immersed in watching Lydia use a ladle to scoop the beans and meat. She seemed to have an eye for the exact amount. She must have been aware that I was admiring her maneuvers. She took 2 or 3 beans from Rosa's bowl and returned them to the pot. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Josefina coming into the kitchen. I didn't look at her, though. She sat facing me across the table. I had a squeamish feeling in my stomach. I felt that I couldn't eat with that woman looking at me. To ease my tension, I joked with Lydia that there were still 2 extra beans in Rosa's bowl that she had overlooked. She scooped up 2 beans with the ladle with a precision that made me gasp. I laughed nervously, knowing that once Lydia sat down, I would have to move my eyes from the stove and acknowledge the presence of Josefina. I finally and reluctantly had to look across the table at Josefina. There was a dead silence. I stared at her incredulously. My mouth fell open. I heard the loud laughter of Lydia and Rosa. It took an endless moment for me to put my thoughts and feelings in some sort of order. Whoever was facing me was not the Josefina I had seen just a while ago, but a very pretty girl. She didn't have Indian features as Lydia and Rosa did. She seemed to be more Latin than Indian. She had a light olive complexion, a very small mouth, and a finely chiseled nose, small white teeth, and short, black, curly hair. She had a dimple on the left side of her face, which gave a definite cockiness to her smile. She was the girl I had met briefly years ago. She held my scrutiny. Her eyes were friendly. I became possessed by degrees with some uncontrollable nervousness. I ended up desperately clowning about my genuine bewilderment. They laughed like children. After their laughter had subsided, I wanted to know what was the point of Josefina's histrionic display. "She's practicing the art of stalking," Lydia said. "The Nagual taught us to baffle people so they wouldn't notice us. Josefina's very pretty, and if she walks alone at night, no one will bother her if she is ugly and smelly. But if she goes out as she really is, well, you yourself can tell what would happen." Josefina nodded affirmatively and then contorted her face into the ugliest grimace possible. "She can hold that face all day," Lydia said. I contended that if I lived around that area, I would certainly notice Josefina and her disguise more readily than if she didn't have one. "That disguise was just for you," Lydia said, and all 3 of them laughed. "And look how it baffled you. You noticed her child even more than you noticed her." Lydia went into the room and brought out a package of rags that looked like a bundled-up child and threw it on the table in front of me. I laughed uproariously with them. "Do all of you have particular disguises?" I asked. "No, only Josefina. No one around here knows her as she really is," Lydia replied. Josefina nodded and smiled, but she remained silent. I liked her tremendously. There was something so very innocent and sweet about her. "Say something, Josefina," I said, grabbing her by her forearms. She looked at me, bewildered, and recoiled. I thought that I had gotten carried away by my elation and perhaps grabbed her too hard. I let her go. She sat up straight. She contorted her small mouth and thin lips and produced a most grotesque outburst of grunts and shrieks. Her whole face suddenly changed. A series of ugly, involuntary spasms marred her tranquil expression of a moment before. I looked at her, horrified. Lydia pulled me by the sleeve. "Why do you have to scare her, stupid?" she whispered. "Don't you know that she became mute and can't talk at all?" Josefina obviously understood her and seemed bent on protesting. She clenched her fist at Lydia and let out another outburst of extremely loud and horrifying shrieks, and then choked and coughed. Rosa began to rub her back. Lydia tried to do the same, but Josefina nearly hit her in the face. Lydia sat down next to me and made a gesture of impotence. She shrugged her shoulders. "She's that way?" Lydia whispered to me. Josefina turned to her. Her face was contorted in a most ugly grimace of anger. She opened her mouth and bellowed at the top of her voice some more frightening guttural sounds. Lydia slid off the bench and in a most unobtrusive manner left the kitchen area. Rosa held Josefina by the arm. Josefina seemed to be the epitome of fury. She moved her mouth and contorted her face. In a matter of minutes, she had lost all the beauty and innocence that had enchanted me. I didn't know what to do. I tried to apologize, but Josefina's inhuman sounds drowned out my words. Finally, Rosa took her into the house. Lydia returned and sat across the table from me. "Something went wrong up here," she said, touching her head. "When did it happen?" I asked. "A long time ago. The Nagual must have done something to her because all of a sudden she lost her speech." Lydia seemed sad. I had the impression that her sadness showed against her desire. I even felt tempted to tell her not to struggle so hard to hide her emotions. "How does Josefina communicate with you people?" I asked. "Does she write?" "Come on, don't be silly. She doesn't write. She's not you. She uses her hands and feet to tell us what she wants." Josefina and Rosa came back to the kitchen. They stood by my side. I thought that Josefina was again the picture of innocence and candor. Her beatific expression didn't give the slightest inkling of the fact that she could become so ugly so fast. Looking at her, I had the sudden realization that her fabulous ability for gestures undoubtedly was intimately linked to her aphasia. I reasoned that only a person who had lost her capacity to verbalize could be so versed in mimicry. Rosa said that Josefina had confided that she wished she could talk because she liked me very much. "Until you came, she was happy the way she was," Lydia said in a harsh voice. Josefina shook her head affirmatively, corroborating Lydia's statement, and went into a mild outburst of sounds. "I wish La Gorda was here," Rosa said. "Lydia always gets Josefina angry." "I don't mean to," Lydia protested. Josefina smiled at her and extended her arm to touch her. It seemed as if she was attempting to apologize. Lydia brushed her hand away. "Why, you mute imbecile," she muttered. Josefina didn't get angry. She looked away. There was so much sadness in her eyes that I didn't want to look at her. I felt compelled to intercede. "She thinks she's the only woman in the world who has problems," Lydia snapped at me. "The Nagual told us to drive her hard and without mercy until she no longer feels sorry for herself." Rosa looked at me and reaffirmed Lydia's claim with a nod of her head. Lydia turned to Rosa and ordered her to leave Josefina's side. Rosa moved away complyingly and sat on the bench next to me. "The Nagual said that one of these days she will talk again," Lydia said to me. "Hey," Rosa said, pulling my sleeve. "Maybe you're the one who'll make her talk." "Yes," Lydia exclaimed, as if she had had the same thought. "Maybe that's why we had to wait for you." "It's so clear," Rosa added, with the expression of having had a true revelation. Both of them jumped to their feet and embraced Josefina. "You're going to talk again," Rosa exclaimed as she shook Josefina by the shoulders. Josefina opened her eyes and rolled them. She started making faint, muffled sighs as if she were sobbing and ended up running back and forth, crying like an animal. Her excitation was so great that she seemed to have locked her jaws open. I honestly thought she was on the brink of a nervous breakdown. Lydia and Rosa ran to her side and helped her close her mouth, but they didn't try to calm her down. "You're going to talk again! You're going to talk again!" they shouted. Josefina sobbed and howled in a manner that sent chills down my spine. I was absolutely confounded. I tried to talk sense to them. I appealed to their reason, but then I realized that they had very little of it, by my standards. I paced back and forth in front of them, trying to figure out what to do. "You are going to help her, aren't you?" Lydia demanded. "Please, sir, please," Rosa pleaded with me. I told them that they were crazy, that I couldn't possibly know what to do. And yet as I talked, I noticed that there was a funny feeling of optimism and certainty in the back of my mind. I wanted to discard it at first, but it took hold of me. Once before, I had had a similar feeling in relation to a dear friend of mine who was mortally ill. I thought I could make her well and actually leave the hospital where she lay dying. I even consulted Don Juan about it. "Sure, you can cure her and make her walk out of that death trap," he said. "How?" I asked him. "It's a very simple procedure," he said. "All you have to do is remind her that she's an incurable patient. Since she's a terminal case, she has power. She has nothing to lose anymore. She's lost everything already. When one has nothing to lose, one becomes courageous. We are timid only when there is something we can still cling to." "But is it enough just to remind her of that?" "No, that will give her the boost she needs. Then she has to push the disease away with her left hand. She must push her arm out in front of her with her hand clenched as if she were holding a knob. She must push on and on. She says, 'Out, out, out.' Tell her that since she has nothing else to do, she must dedicate every second of her remaining life to performing that movement. I assure you that she can get up and walk away if she wants to." "It sounds so simple," I said. Don Juan chuckled. "It seems simple," he said, "but it isn't. In order to do this, your friend needs an impeccable spirit." He looked at me for a long time. He seemed to be measuring the concern and sadness I felt for my friend. "Of course," he added, "if your friend had an impeccable spirit, she wouldn't be there in the first place." I told my friend what Don Juan had said, but she was already too weak even to attempt to move her arm. In Josefina's case, my rationale for my secret confidence was the fact that she was a warrior with an impeccable spirit. Would it be possible, I silently asked myself, to apply the same hand movement to her? I told Josefina that her incapacity to speak was due to some sort of blockage. Yes, it's a blockage," Lydia and Rosa repeated after me. I explained to Josefina the arm movement and told her that she had to push that blockage by moving her arm in that fashion. Josefina's eyes were transfixed. She seemed to be in a trance. She moved her mouth, making barely audible sounds. She tried moving her arm, but her excitation was so intense that she flung her arm without any coordination. I tried to redirect her movements, but she appeared to be so thoroughly befuddled that she couldn't even hear what I was saying. Her eyes went out of focus, and I knew she was going to faint. Rosa apparently realized what was happening. She jumped away and grabbed a cup of water and sprinkled it over Josefina's face. Josefina's eyes rolled back, showing the whites of her eyes. She blinked repeatedly until she could focus her eyes again. She moved her mouth, but she made no sound. "Touch her throat," Rosa yelled at me. No, Lydia shouted back. "Touch her head. It's in her head, you dummy." She grabbed my hand, and I reluctantly let her place it on Josefina's head. Josefina shivered, and little by little she let out a series of faint sounds. Somehow they seemed to me more melodious than the inhuman sounds she made before. Rosa also must have noticed the difference. "Did you hear that? Did you hear that?" she asked me in a whisper. But whatever the difference might have been, Josefina let out another series of sounds more grotesque than ever. When she quieted down, she sobbed for a moment and then entered into another state of euphoria. Lydia and Rosa finally quieted her. She plunked down on the bench, apparently exhausted. She could barely lift her eyelids to look at me. She smiled meekly. "I am so very, very sorry," I said, and held her hand. Her whole body vibrated. She'd lowered her head and began to weep again. I felt a surge of ultimate empathy for her. At that moment, I would have given my life to help her. She sobbed uncontrollably as she tried to speak to me. Lydia and Rosa appeared to be so caught up in her drama that they were making the same gestures with their mouths. For heaven's sake, do something, Rosa exclaimed in a pleading voice. I experienced an unbearable anxiety. Josefina stood up and embraced me, or rather clung to me in a frenzy and pushed me away from the table. At that instant, Lydia and Rosa, with astounding agility, speed, and control, grabbed me by the shoulders with both hands and at the same time hooked the heels of my feet with their feet. The weight of Josefina's body and her embrace, plus the speed of Lydia and Rosa's maneuver, rendered me helpless. They all moved at once, and before I knew what was happening, they had laid me on the floor with Josefina on top of me. I felt her heart pounding. She held on to me with great force. The sound of her heart reverberated in my ears. I felt it pounding in my own chest. I tried to push her away, but she held on fast. Rosa and Lydia had me pinned down on the floor with their weight on my arms and legs. Rosa cackled insanely and began nibbling on my side. Her small, sharp teeth chattered as her jaws snapped open and shut with nervous spasms. All at once, I had a monstrous sensation of pain, physical revulsion, and terror. I lost my breath. My eyes couldn't focus. I knew that I was passing out. I heard then the dry, cracking sound of a pipe breaking at the base of my neck and felt the ticklish sensation on top of my head running like a shiver through my entire body. The next thing I knew, I was looking at them from the other side of the kitchen. The three girls were staring at me while they lay on the floor. "What are you people doing?" I heard someone say in a loud, harsh, commanding voice. I then had an inconceivable feeling. I felt Josefina let go of me and stand up. I was lying on the floor, and yet I was also standing a distance away from them, looking at a woman I had never seen before. She was by the door. She walked toward me and stopped 6 or 7 feet away. She stared at me for a moment. I knew immediately that she was La Gorda. She demanded to know what was going on. "We were just playing a little joke on him," Josefina said, clearing her throat. I was pretending to be mute. The three girls huddled up close together and began to laugh. La Gorda remained impassive, looking at me. They had tricked me. I found my stupidity and gullibility so outrageous that I had a fit of hysterical laughter which was almost out of control. My body shivered. I knew that Josefina had not just been playing, as she had claimed. The three of them had meant business. I had actually felt Josefina's body as a force that, in fact, was getting inside my own body. Rosa's nibbling on my side, which undoubtedly was a ruse to distract my attention, coincided with the sensation I had had that Josefina's heart was pounding inside my chest. I heard La Gorda urging me to calm down. I had a nervous flutter in my midsection, and then a quiet, calm anger swept over me. I loathed them. I had had enough of them. I would have picked up my jacket and writing pad and walked out of the house had it not been that I wasn't quite myself yet. I was somewhat dizzy, and my senses were definitely out of line. I had had the sensation that when I had first looked at the girls from across the kitchen, I was actually viewing them from a position above my eye level, from a place close to the ceiling. But something even more disconcerting was that I had actually perceived that the ticklish sensation on top of my head was what scooped me from Josefina's embrace. It was not as if something came out from the top of my head. Something actually did come out from the top of my head. A few years before, Don Juan and Don Genaro had maneuvered my perception, and I had had an impossible double sensation. I felt that Don Juan had fallen on top of me and pinned me to the ground, while at the same time I felt I was still standing up. I was actually in both places at once. In sorcerer's terms, I could say that my body had stored the memory of that double perception and seemed to have repeated it. There were, however, two new things that had been added to my bodily memory this time. One was that the ticklish sensation I had become so aware of during the course of my confrontations with those women was the vehicle to arriving at that double perception, and the other was that the sound at the base of my neck let loose something in me that was capable of coming out of the top of my head. After a minute or two, I definitely felt that I was coming down from near the ceiling until I was standing on the floor. It took a while for my eyes to adjust to seeing at my normal eye level. As I looked at the four women, I felt naked and vulnerable. I then had an instant of disassociation or lack of perceptual continuity. It was as if I had shut my eyes and some force suddenly had made me twirl a couple of times. When I opened my eyes, the girls were staring at me with their mouths open. But somehow, I was myself again. Chapter 3. La Gorda. The first thing I noticed about La Gorda was her eyes, very dark and calm. She seemed to be examining me from head to toe. Her eyes scanned my body the same way Don Juan's used to. In fact, her eyes had the same calmness and force. I knew why she was the best. The thought that came to my mind was that Don Juan must have left her his eyes. She was slightly taller than the other three girls. She had a lean, dark body and a superb back. I noticed the graceful line of her broad shoulders when she half turned her upper body to face the three girls. She gave them an unintelligible command, and the three of them sat down on a bench right behind her. She was actually shielding them from me with her body. She turned to face me again. Her expression was one of utmost seriousness, but without a trace of gloom or heaviness. She didn't smile, and yet she was friendly. She had very pleasant features, a nicely shaped face, neither round nor angular, a small mouth with thin lips, a broad nose, high cheekbones, and long jet-black hair. I couldn't help noticing her beautiful, muscular hands, which she kept clasped in front of her over her umbilical region. The backs of her hands were turned to me. I could see her muscles being contracted rhythmically as she clasped her palms. She was wearing a long, faded orange cotton dress with long sleeves and a brown shawl. There was something terribly calming and final about her. I felt the presence of Don Juan. My body relaxed. Sit down, she said to me in a coaxing tone. I walked back to the table. She pointed out a place for me to sit, but I remained standing. She smiled for the first time, and her eyes became softer and shinier. She wasn't as pretty as Josefina, and yet she was the most beautiful of all of them. We were quiet for a moment. In terms of an explanation, she said that they had done their best in the years since the Nagual left, and that because of their dedication, they had become accustomed to the task that he had left for them to perform. I didn't quite understand what she was talking about, but as she spoke, I felt more than ever the presence of Don Juan. It was not that she was copying his manners or the inflection of his voice. She had an inner control that made her act the way Don Juan did. Their similarity was from the inside out. I told her that I had come because I needed Pablito's and Nestor's help. I said that I was rather slow or even stupid in understanding the ways of sorcerers, but that I was sincere, and yet all of them had treated me with malice and deceitfulness. She began to apologize, but I didn't let her finish. I picked up my things and went out the front door. She ran after me. She wasn't preventing me from leaving, but rather she was talking very fast, as if she needed to say all she could before I drove away. She said that I had to hear her out, and that she was willing to ride with me until she had told me everything the Nagual had entrusted her to tell me. I'm going to Mexico City, I said. I'll ride with you to Los Angeles if necessary, she said, and I knew that she meant it. All right, I said, just to test her. Get in the car. She vacillated for an instant, then she stood silently and faced her house. She put her clasped hands just below her navel. She turned and faced the valley and did the same movement with her hands. I knew what she was doing. She was saying goodbye to her house and to those awesome round hills that surrounded it. Don Juan had taught me that goodbye gesture years before. He had stressed that it was an extremely powerful gesture and that a warrior had to use it sparingly. I had had very few occasions to perform it myself. The goodbye movement La Gorda was executing was a variant of the one Don Juan had taught me. He had said that the hands were clasped as in prayer, either gently or with great speed, even producing a clapping sound. Done either way, the purpose of clasping the hands was to imprison the feeling that the warrior did not wish to leave behind. As soon as the hands had closed in and captured that feeling, they were taken with great force to the middle of the chest at the level of the heart. There the feeling became a dagger, and the warrior stabbed himself with it, as if holding the dagger with both hands. Don Juan had told me that a warrior said goodbye in that fashion only when he had reason to feel he might not come back. La Gorda's goodbye enthralled me. Are you saying goodbye? I asked, out of curiosity. Yes, she said dryly. Don't you put your hands to your chest? I asked. Men do that. Women have wombs. They store their feelings there. Aren't you supposed to say goodbye like that only when you're not coming back? I asked. Chances are I may not come back, she replied. I'm going with you. I had an attack of unwarranted sadness. Unwarranted in the sense that I didn't know that woman at all. I had only doubts and suspicions about her. But as I peered into her clear eyes, I had a sense of ultimate kinship with her. I mellowed. My anger had disappeared and given way to a strange sadness. I looked around and I knew that those mysterious, enormous, round hills were ripping me apart. Those hills over there are alive, she said, reading my thoughts. I turned to her and told her that both the place and the women had affected me at a very deep level, a level I couldn't ordinarily conceive. I didn't know which was more devastating, the place or the women. The women's onslaughts had been direct and terrifying, but the effect of those hills was a constant nagging apprehension, a desire to flee from them. When I told that to La Gorda, she said I was correct in assessing the effect of that place, that the Nagual had left them there because of that effect, and that I shouldn't blame anyone for what had happened, because the Nagual himself had given those women orders to try to do away with me. Did he give orders like that to you too? I asked. No, not to me. I'm different than they are, she said. They are sisters. They are the same, exactly the same, just like Pablito, Nestor, and Benigno are the same. Only you and I can be exactly the same. We are not now because you're still incomplete, but someday we will be the same. Exactly the same. I've been told that you're the only one who knows where the Nagual and Genaro are now, I said. She peered at me for a moment and shook her head affirmatively. That's right, she said. I know where they are. The Nagual told me to take you there if I can. I told her to stop beating around the bush and to reveal their exact whereabouts to me immediately. My demand seemed to plunge her into chaos. She apologized and reassured me that later on, when we were on our way, she would disclose everything to me. She begged me not to ask her about them anymore because she had strict orders not to mention anything until the right moment. Lydia and Josefina came to the door and stared at me. I hurriedly got in the car. La Gorda got in after me, and as she did, I couldn't help observing that she had entered the car as if she would have entered a tunnel. She sort of crawled in. Don Juan used to do that. I jokingly said once after I had seen him do it scores of times that it was more functional to get in the way I did. I thought that perhaps his lack of familiarity with automobiles was responsible for his strange way of entering. He explained then that the car was a cave, and that caves had to be entered in that fashion if we were going to use them. There was an inherent spirit to caves, whether they were natural or man-made, and that spirit had to be approached with respect. Crawling was the only way of showing that respect. I was wondering whether or not to ask La Gorda if Don Juan had instructed her about such details, but she spoke first. She said that the Nagual had given her specific instructions about what to do in case I would survive the attacks of Doña Soledad and the 3 girls. Then she casually added that before I headed for Mexico City, we had to go to a specific place in the mountains where Don Juan and I used to go, and that there she would reveal all the information the Nagual had never disclosed to me. I had a moment of indecision. Then, something in me which was not my reason made me head for the mountains. We drove in complete silence. I attempted at various opportune moments to start up a conversation, but she turned me down every time with a strong shake of her head. Finally, she seemed to have gotten tired of my trying and said forcefully that what she had to say required a place of power, and until we were in one, we had to abstain from draining ourselves with useless talk. After a long drive and an exhausting hike away from the road, we finally reached our destination. It was late afternoon. We were in a deep canyon. The bottom of it was already dark while the sun was still shining on the top of the mountains above it. We walked until we came to a small cave a few feet up the north side of the canyon, which ran from east to west. I used to spend a great deal of time there with Don Juan. Before we entered the cave, La Gorda carefully swept the floor with branches the way Don Juan used to, in order to clear the ticks and parasites from the rocks. Then she cut a large heap of small branches with soft leaves from the surrounding bushes and placed them on the rock floor like a mat. She motioned me to enter. I had always let Don Juan enter first as a sign of respect. I wanted to do the same with her, but she declined. She said I was the Nagual. I crawled into the cave the same way she had crawled into my car. I laughed at my inconsistency. I had never been able to treat my car as a cave. She coaxed me to relax and make myself comfortable. The reason the Nagual could not reveal all his designs to you was because you're incomplete, La Gorda said all of a sudden. You still are, but now, after your bouts with Soledad and the sisters, you are stronger than before. What's the meaning of being incomplete? Everyone has told me that you're the only one who can explain that, I said. It's a very simple matter, she said. A complete person is one who has never had children. She paused as if she were allowing me time to write down what she had said. I looked up from my notes. She was staring at me, judging the effect of her words. I know that the Nagual told you exactly what I've just said, she continued. You didn't pay any attention to him, and you probably haven't paid any attention to me either. I read my notes out loud and repeated what she had said. She giggled. The Nagual said that an incomplete person is one who has had children, she said, as if dictating to me. She scrutinized me, apparently waiting for a question or a comment. I had none. Now, I've told you everything about being complete and incomplete, she said, and I've told you just like the Nagual told me. It didn't mean anything to me at that time, and it doesn't mean anything to you now. I had to laugh at the way she patterned herself after Don Juan. An incomplete person has a hole in their stomach, she went on. A sorcerer can see it as plainly as you can see my head. When the hole is on the left side of one's stomach, the child who created that hole is of the same sex. If it is on the right side, the child is of the opposite sex. The hole on the left side is black. The one on the right is dark brown. Can you see that hole in anyone who has had children? Sure. There are two ways of seeing it. A sorcerer may see it in dreaming or by looking directly at a person. A sorcerer who sees has no problem in viewing the luminous being to find out if there is a hole in the luminosity of the body. But even if the sorcerer doesn't know how to see, he can look and actually distinguish the darkness of the hole through the clothing. She stopped talking. I urged her to go on. The Nagual told me that you write and then you don't remember what you wrote, she said with a tone of accusation. I became entangled in words trying to defend myself. Nonetheless, what she had said was the truth. Don Juan's words always had had a double effect on me. Once when I heard for the first time whatever he had said, and then when I read at home whatever I had written down and had forgotten about. Talking to La Gorda, however, was intrinsically different. Don Juan's apprentices were not in any way as engulfing as he was. Their revelations, although extraordinary, were only missing pieces to a jigsaw puzzle. The unusual character of those pieces was that with them, the picture did not become clearer, but that it became more and more complex. You had a brown hole in the right side of your stomach, she continued. That means that a woman emptied you. You made a female child. The Nagual said that I had a huge black hole myself, because I made 2 women. I never saw the hole, but I've seen other people with holes like mine. You said that I had a hole. Don't I have it anymore? No, it's been patched. The Nagual helped you to patch it. Without his help, you would be more empty than you are now. What kind of a patch is it? A patch in your luminosity. There's no other way of saying it. The Nagual said that a sorcerer like himself can fill up the hole any time, but that filling is only a patch without luminosity. Anyone who sees or does dreaming can tell that it looks like a lead patch on the yellow luminosity of the rest of the body. The Nagual patched you and me and Soledad, but then he left it up to us to put back the shine, the luminosity. How did he patch us? He's a sorcerer. He put things in our bodies. He replaced us. We are no longer the same. The patch is what he put there himself. But how did he put those things there, and what were they? What he put in our bodies was his own luminosity, and he used his hand to do that. He simply reached into our bodies and left his fibers there. He did the same with all of his 6 children, and also with Soledad. All of them are the same except Soledad. She's something else. La Gorda seemed unwilling to go on. She vacillated and almost began to stutter. What is Doña Soledad? I insisted. It's very hard to tell, she said after considerable coaxing. She is the same as you and me, and yet she's different. She has the same luminosity, but she's not together with us. She goes in the opposite direction. Right now, she's more like you. Both of you have patches that look like lead. Mine is gone, and I'm again a complete luminous egg. That's the reason I said that you and I will be exactly the same someday, when you become complete again. Right now, what makes us almost the same is the Nagual's luminosity and the fact that both of us are going in the same direction, and that we both were empty. What does a complete person look like to a sorcerer? I asked. Like a luminous egg made out of fibers, she said. All the fibers are complete. They look like strings, taut strings. It looks as if the strings have been tightened like a drum is tightened. On an empty person, on the other hand, the fibers are crumpled up at the edges of the hole. When they have had many children, the fibers don't look like fibers anymore. Those people look like two chunks of luminosity separated by blackness. It is an awesome sight. The Nagual made me see them one day when we were in a park in the city. Why do you think the Nagual never told me about all this? He told you everything, but you never understood him correctly. As soon as he realized that you were not understanding what he was saying, he was compelled to change the subject. Your emptiness prevented you from understanding. The Nagual said that it was perfectly natural for you not to understand. Once a person becomes incomplete, he's actually empty, like a gourd that has been hollowed out. It didn't matter to you how many times he told you that you were empty. It didn't matter that he even explained it to you. You never knew what he meant, or worse yet, you didn't want to know. La Gorda was treading on dangerous ground. I tried to head her off with another question, but she rebuffed me. You love a little boy, and you don't want to understand what the Nagual meant, she said accusingly. The Nagual told me that you have a daughter you've never seen, and that you love that little boy. One took your edge, the other pinned you down. You have welded them together. I had to stop writing. I crawled out of the cave and stood up. I began to walk down the steep incline to the floor of the gully. La Gorda followed me. She asked me if I was upset by her directness. I didn't want to lie. What do you think? I asked. You're fuming, she exclaimed, and giggled with an abandon that I had witnessed only in Don Juan and Don Genaro. She seemed about to lose her balance and grabbed my left arm. In order to help her get down to the floor of the gully, I lifted her up by her waist. I thought that she could not have weighed more than 100 pounds. She puckered her lips the way Don Genaro used to and said that her weight was 115. We both laughed at once. It was a moment of direct, instant communication. Why does it bother you so much to talk about these things? She asked. I told her that once I had a little boy whom I had loved immensely. I felt the imperative to tell her about him. Some extravagant need beyond my comprehension made me open up with that woman, who was a total stranger to me. As I began to talk about that little boy, a wave of nostalgia enveloped me. Perhaps it was the place, or the situation, or the time of day. Somehow, I had merged the memory of that little boy with the memory of Don Juan, and for the first time in all the time I had not seen him. I missed Don Juan. Lydia had said that they never missed him because he was always with them. He was their bodies and their spirits. I had known instantly what she meant. I felt the same way myself. In that gully, however, an unknown feeling had overtaken me. I told La Gorda that I had never missed Don Juan until that moment. She didn't answer. She looked away. Possibly, my feeling of longing for those two people had to do with the fact that both of them had produced catharses in my life. And both of them were gone. I hadn't realized until that moment how final that separation was. I said to La Gorda that that little boy had been, more than anything else, my friend, and that one day he was whisked away by forces I could not control. That was perhaps one of the greatest blows I have ever received. I even went to see Don Juan to ask his assistance. It was the only time I had ever asked him for help. He listened to my plea, and then he broke into uproarious laughter. His reaction was so unexpected that I couldn't even get angry. I could only comment on what I thought was his insensitivity. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. I said that since he was a sorcerer, perhaps he could help me to regain my little friend for my solace. "You're wrong. A warrior doesn't seek anything for his solace," he said, in a tone that did not admit reproach. Then he proceeded to smash my arguments. He said that a warrior could not possibly leave anything to chance, that a warrior actually affected the outcome of events by the force of his awareness and his unbending intent. He said that if I would have had the unbending intent to keep and help that child, I would have taken measures to assure his stay with me. But as it was, my love was merely a word, a useless outburst of an empty man. He then told me something about emptiness and completeness, but I didn't want to hear it. All I felt was a sense of loss, and the emptiness that he had mentioned, I was sure, referred to the feeling of having lost someone irreplaceable. "You loved him, you honored his spirit, you wished him well, but now you must forget him," he said. But I had not been able to do so. There was something terribly alive in my emotions, even though time had mellowed them. At one point, I thought I had forgotten, but then one night an incident produced the deepest emotional upheaval in me. I was walking to my office when a young Mexican woman approached me. She had been sitting on a bench waiting for a bus. She wanted to know if that particular bus went to a children's hospital. I didn't know. She explained that her little boy had had a high temperature for a long time, and she was worried because she didn't have any money. I moved toward the bench and saw a little boy standing on the seat with his head against the back of the bench. He was wearing a jacket, short pants, and a cap. He couldn't have been more than 2 years old. He must have seen me, for he walked to the edge of the bench and put his head against my leg. "My little head hurts," he said to me in Spanish. His voice was so tiny and his dark eyes so sad that a wave of irrepressible anguish welled up in me. I picked him up and drove him and his mother to the nearest hospital. I left them there and gave the mother enough money to pay the bill. But I didn't want to stay or to know any more about it. I wanted to believe that I had helped him and that by doing so I had paid back to the spirit of man. I had learned the magical act of paying back to the spirit of man from Don Juan. I had asked him once, overwhelmed by the realization that I could never pay him back for all he had done to me, if there was anything in the world I could do to even the score. We were leaving a bank after exchanging some Mexican currency. "I don't need you to pay me back," he said. "But if you still want to pay back, make your deposit to the spirit of man. That's always a very small account, and whatever one puts in it is more than enough." By helping that sick child, I had merely paid back to the spirit of man for any help that my little boy may receive from strangers along his path. I told La Gorda that my love for him would remain alive for the rest of my life, even though I would never see him again. I wanted to tell her that the memory I had of him was buried so deep that nothing could touch it, but I desisted. I felt it would have been superfluous to talk about it. Besides, it was getting dark and I wanted to get out of that gully. "We better go," I said. "I'll take you home. Maybe some other time we can talk about these things again." She laughed, the way Don Juan used to laugh at me. I had apparently said something utterly funny. "Why do you laugh, Gorda?" I asked. "Because you know yourself that we can't leave this place just like that," she said. "You have an appointment with power here, and so do I." She walked back to the cave and crawled in. "Come on in," she yelled from inside. "There's no way to leave." I reacted most incongruously. I crawled in and sat next to her again. It was evident that she, too, had tricked me. I hadn't come there to have any confrontations. I should have been furious. I was indifferent instead. I couldn't lie to myself that I had only stopped there on my way to Mexico City. I had gone there, compelled by something beyond my comprehension. She handed me my notebook and motioned me to write. She said that if I wrote, I would not only relax myself, but I would also relax her. "What is this appointment with power?" I asked. "The Nagual told me that you and I have an appointment here with something out there. You first had an appointment with Soledad, and then one with the Little Sisters. They were supposed to destroy you. The Nagual said that if you survived their assaults, I had to bring you here so that we together could keep the third appointment." "What kind of appointment is it?" "I really don't know. Like everything else, it depends on us. Right now, there are some things out there that have been waiting for you. I say that they have been waiting for you because I come here by myself all the time and nothing ever happens. But tonight is different. You are here, and those things will come." "Why is the Nagual trying to destroy me?" I asked. "He's not trying to destroy anybody," La Gorda exclaimed in protest. "You are his child. Now he wants you to be himself, more himself than any of us. But to be a true Nagual, you have to claim your power. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so careful in setting up Soledad and the Little Sisters to stalk you. He taught Soledad how to change her shape and rejuvenate herself. He made her construct a devilish floor in her room, a floor no one can oppose. You see, Soledad is empty, so the Nagual set her up to do something gigantic. He gave her a task, a most difficult and dangerous task, but the only one which was suited for her, and that was to finish you off. He told her that nothing could be more difficult than for one sorcerer to kill another. It's easier for an average man to kill a sorcerer, or for a sorcerer to kill an average man, but two sorcerers don't fit well at all. The Nagual told Soledad that her best bet was to surprise you and scare you, and that's what she did. The Nagual set her up to be a desirable woman, so she could lure you into her room, and there her floor would have bewitched you, because, as I've said, no one can stand up to that floor. That floor was the Nagual's masterpiece for Soledad. But you did something to her floor, and Soledad had to change her tactics in accordance with the Nagual's instructions. He told her that if her floor failed and she couldn't frighten and surprise you, she had to talk to you and tell you everything you wanted to know. The Nagual trained her to talk very well as her last resource, but Soledad could not overpower you even with that. Why was it so important to overpower me? She paused and peered at me. She cleared her throat and sat up straight. She looked up at the low roof of the cave and exhaled noisily through her nose. Soledad is a woman like myself, she said. I'll tell you something about my own life, and maybe you'll understand her. I had a man once. He got me pregnant when I was very young, and I had 2 daughters with him, one after the other. My life was hell. That man was a drunkard and beat me day and night, and I hated him, and he hated me, and I got fat like a pig. One day, another man came along and told me that he liked me and wanted me to go with him to work in the city as a paid servant. He knew I was a hard-working woman and only wanted to exploit me. But my life was so miserable that I fell for it and went with him. He was worse than the first man, mean and fearsome. He couldn't stand me after a week or so. And he used to give me the worst beatings you can imagine. I thought he was going to kill me, and he wasn't even drunk, and all because I hadn't found work. Then he sent me to beg on the streets with a sick baby. He would pay the child's mother something from the money I got, and then he would beat me because I hadn't made enough. The child got sicker and sicker, and I knew that if it died while I was begging, the man would kill me. So one day when I knew that he wasn't there, I went to the child's mother and gave her her baby and some of the money I had made that day. That was a lucky day for me. A kind foreign lady had given me 50 pesos to buy medicine for the baby. I had been with that horrible man for 3 months, and I thought it had been 20 years. I used the money to go back to my home. I was pregnant again. The man had wanted me to have a child of my own so that he wouldn't have to pay for it. When I got to my hometown, I tried to go back to see my children, but they had been taken away by their father's family. All the family got together under the pretense that they wanted to talk to me, but instead they took me to a deserted place and beat me with sticks and rocks and left me for dead. La Gorda showed me the many scars on her scalp. To this day, I don't know how I made it back to town. I even lost the child I had in my womb. I went to an aunt I still had. My parents were dead. She gave me a place to rest, and she tended to me. She fed me, the poor soul, for 2 months before I could get up. Then one day, my aunt told me that that man was in town looking for me. He had talked to the police and had said that he had given me money in advance to work and that I had run away, stealing the money after I had killed a woman's baby. I knew that the end had come for me. But my luck turned right again, and I caught a ride in the truck of an American. I saw the truck coming on the road, and I lifted my hand in desperation, and the man stopped and let me get on. He drove me all the way to this part of Mexico. He dropped me in the city. I didn't know a soul. I roamed all over the place for days like a crazy dog, eating garbage from the street. That was when my luck turned for the last time. I met Pablito, with whom I have a debt that I can't pay back. Pablito took me to his carpentry shop and gave me a corner there to put my bed. He did that because he felt sorry for me. He found me in the market after he stumbled and fell on top of me. I was sitting there, begging. A moth, or a bee, I don't know which, flew to him and hit him in the eye. He turned around on his heels and stumbled and fell right on top of me. I thought he would be so mad that he would hit me, but he gave me money instead. I asked him if he could give me work. That was when he took me to his shop and set me up with an iron and an ironing board to do laundry. I did very well, except that I got fatter because most of the people I washed for fed me with their leftovers. Sometimes I ate 16 times a day. I did nothing else but eat. Kids in the street used to taunt me and sneak behind me and step on my heels, and then someone would push me and I would fall. Those kids made me cry with their cruel jokes, especially when they used to spoil my wash on purpose. One day, very late in the afternoon, a weird old man came over to see Pablito. I had never seen that man before. I had never known that Pablito was in cahoots with such a scary, awesome man. I turned my back to him and kept on working. I was alone there. Suddenly, I felt the hands of that man on my neck. My heart stopped. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even breathe. I fell down, and that awful man held my head, maybe for an hour. Then he left. I was so frightened that I stayed where I had fallen until the next morning. Pablito found me there. He laughed and said that I should be very proud and happy because that old man was a powerful sorcerer and was one of his teachers. I was dumbfounded. I couldn't believe Pablito was a sorcerer. He said that his teacher had seen a perfect circle of moths flying over my head. He had also seen my death circling around me, and that was why he had acted like lightning and had changed the direction of my eyes. Pablito also said that the Nagual had laid his hands on me and had reached into my body, and that soon I would be different. I had no idea what he was talking about. I had no idea what that crazy old man had done either, but it didn't matter to me. I was like a dog that everyone kicked around. Pablito had been the only person who had been kind to me. At first I had thought he wanted me for his woman, but I was too ugly and fat and smelly. He just wanted to be kind to me. The crazy old man came back another night and grabbed me again by the neck from behind. He hurt me terribly. I cried and screamed. I didn't know what he was doing. He never said a word to me. I was deathly afraid of him. Then later on, he began to talk to me and told me what to do with my life. I liked what he said. He took me everywhere with him. But my emptiness was my worst enemy. I couldn't accept his ways, so one day he got sick and tired of pampering me and sent the wind after me. I was in the back of Soledad's house by myself that day, and I felt the wind getting very strong. It was blowing through the fence. It got into my eyes. I wanted to get inside the house, but my body was frightened, and instead of walking through the door, I walked through the gate in the fence. The wind pushed me and made me twirl. I tried to go back to the house, but it was useless. I couldn't break the force of the wind. It pushed me over the hills and off the road, and I ended up in a deep hole, a hole like a tomb. The wind kept me there for days and days until I had decided to change and accept my fate without recrimination. Then the wind stopped, and the Nagual found me and took me back to the house. He told me that my task was to give what I didn't have, love and affection, and that I had to take care of the sisters, Lydia and Josefina, better than if they were myself. I understood then what the Nagual had been saying to me for years. My life had been over a long time ago. He had offered me a new life, and that life had to be completely new. I couldn't bring to that new life my ugly old ways. That first night he found me, the moths had pointed me out to him. I had no business rebelling against my fate. I began my change by taking care of Lydia and Josefina better than I took care of myself. I did everything the Nagual told me. And one night in this very gully, in this very cave, I found my completeness. I had fallen asleep right here, where I am now. And then a noise woke me up. I looked up and saw myself as I had once been. Thin, young, fresh. It was my spirit that was coming back to me. At first it didn't want to come closer because I still looked pretty awful, but then it couldn't help itself and came to me. I knew right then and all at once what the Nagual had struggled for years to tell me. He had said that when one has a child, that child takes the edge of our spirit. For a woman to have a girl means the end of that edge. To have two, as I did, meant the end of me. The best of my strength and my illusions went to those girls. They stole my edge, the Nagual said, in the same way I had stolen it from my parents. That's our fate. A boy steals the biggest part of his edge from his father, a girl from her mother. The Nagual said that people who have had children could tell, if they aren't as stubborn as you, that something is missing in them. Some craziness, some nervousness, some power that they had before is gone. They used to have it, but where is it now? The Nagual said that it is in the little child running around the house, full of energy, full of illusions. In other words, complete. He said that if we watch children, we can tell that they are daring. They move in leaps. If we watch their parents, we can see that they are cautious and timid. They don't leap anymore. The Nagual told me We explain that by saying that the parents are grown-ups and have responsibility. But that's not true. The truth of the matter is that they have lost their edge. I asked La Gorda what the Nagual would have said if I had told him that I knew parents with much more spirit and edge than their children. She laughed, covering her face in a gesture of sham embarrassment. "You can ask me," she said, giggling. "You want to hear what I think?" "Of course I want to hear it." "Those people don't have more spirit. They merely have a lot of vigor to begin with and have